States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
A reminder to please turn your microphones on and turn your cell phones off. Andrea, we have roll call, please.
Mayor Bain.
Here.
Councillor Lindstrom.
Here.
Councillor Quinlan.
Here.
Councillor Scalisi.
Here.
Councillor Sherman. Here.
We'll have a chance to review the minutes for the meeting of January 28th. Are there any changes or corrections to the minutes?
I have one change. I need to add that City Attorney Bo Chapin was present at the meeting. I left him off.
Okay. Any other changes? Okay, do we have a motion to approve the changes to the minutes? So moved.
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
All those opposed, same sign. Okay, motion carries. Okay, moving on to visitors and delegations. We've got a check the city would like to present to Steve Rohde, the chairman of the Brush Area Museum. Mr. Rohde. This is a $3,500 check for operating expenses for the museum. Thank you very much, Steve.
On behalf of the museum and its board of directors, I would like to thank the city for the continued financial part as well as maintenance part and the storage area. The storage area is working out very well, so thank you very much.
Thank you, Steve. One thing I'd like to point out too, I know the Brush Area Museum has a brick program where they're trying to get money for the museum where you can memorialize family or just to denote your contribution. And I think it's $50 for a small brick, $100 for a large brick.
Yes.
If anyone's interested, they can give Wayne Carlson a call at 842-3119 for details.
You betcha.
Thanks very much, Steve.
You bet.
Hey, you're gonna sit for the whole meeting, you can't take the money.
No, I gotta give it to Mom here.
I get the money.
No wonder he's running.
Okay, moving on to 4B, under visitors and delegation, we have a presentation of floodplain mitigation plan by the Colorado Conservation Board Representative, hope I said this, Regal Rucker?
Rigel.
Oh, okay, okay, sorry. Come on up, please.
All right.
Hey, good afternoon. My name is Rigel Rucker. I'm here, I work with AECOM. I'm here on behalf of the Colorado Water Conservation Board. We're working with them on this project that I'm about to talk about here. So just wanted to make sure you understand that I'm with AECOM. All right. So I'm going to go through a little bit of background just to make sure everyone understands kind of what we just looked at for the city of Brush. Flood risk, there is a flood risk present in the city of Brush, and so one of the things we wanted to look at was what could be done in order to reduce that flood risk. So that's the grand scheme of what we're looking at on this. Flooding does have devastating effects. There's a lot of pieces to it, but the community also participates in the National Flood Insurance Program, and there's certain requirements when a community is shown as having flood risk, that there are certain building requirements, insurance requirements, etc. And so that's another piece to this of why it's important to look at some of this. So up here you'll see a couple of things that I'm going to run through real quick. Like I said, I'm going to give a quick background, continue with the background, and then show the actual alternatives we looked at to see how flood could be mitigated a little bit better in the city. So where this started is flood risk is usually analyzed by engineers, and it's put on FEMA's flood insurance rate maps. So FEMA has a lot of maps showing where flood risk is present. There was a study done, and the latest study showed that the city is at risk of flooding, or at least a portion of it. If you look at this map here, this is an actual excerpt from FEMA's flood insurance rate maps. The hatched piece is what's called a floodway, and I'll talk about that in a second. The blue piece is called the either 100-year or 1% annual chance flood. What that means is you have a 1% chance of having that flood in a single year. And then the kind of the orangish area is the 0.2% annual chance flood. So that's saying in any given year you have a 0.2% chance of flooding there. So because the city participates in the National Flood Insurance Program, or NFIP, there are certain requirements along with that. And this data has been adopted. So what you're seeing here isn't the study we just conducted. This is kind of what spurred the study we conducted. So I want to make sure you can see what that is. So I put this in here. I just kind of talked through this, but it's showing what the different zones and things on those flood insurance rate maps mean. So when you distribute a copy, it's in here kind of describing what I just said. The other piece is the floodway, which I just mentioned. So the floodway is an administrative tool. There's a lot of different terms used to describe a floodway. But what it is an administrative tool, basically saying that the Code of Federal Regulations maintains that if people build in a floodplain such as this, that they don't impact their neighbor by more than a certain amount. In the state of Colorado, that's 1/2 foot. So the floodway shows if you build outside of that, you won't impact your neighbor by that amount. If you build in the floodway, you have to do additional study to determine if there's any impact, because it shows that that's kind of a high-risk area. Now, without a floodway, so the Code of Federal Regulations mandates these are put on here, because without that, an engineering study has to be done every time someone builds to show that you're not impacting your neighbor by that amount. So it's meant to be a helpful administrative tool. If it's, and it's got certain connotations to it. So I wanted to make sure that was understood when you see that on the map. And that's what that hatching was shown on the last version. So that was a really quick background. I'll go through the rest of this. If we have questions, at the end we can go through those. So where this started is, and my understanding is Brush contacted the Colorado Water Conservation Board, or CWCB, and said, we see that, this mapping shows that we're at risk, and we want to know how we can mitigate some of that. So the Colorado Water Conservation Board funded a study, and it's a high-level study that they funded to look at it and see, are there any alternatives that are actually reasonable that the city could take on to kind of reduce that risk so that there's not as much flood potential in the community. Through the effort, Colorado Department of Transportation came to the table and said that they'd at least participate in the discussions. And the Army Corps of Engineers is also doing something similar, where they're also looking at some mitigation techniques that we started communicating with, so we could see what was happening there. So all that kind of kicked it off. Colorado Water Conservation Board called us to help look at some of these alternatives and do some of the engineering behind it. So the first thing we looked at before we got into the alternatives was, is there really a potential, is this flood potential really there? Is it truly there? So we wanted to just kind of verify that. So a couple things we found is there have been a couple floods that are similar to what we just looked at. In 1935, the railroad was overtopped in the downtown. Again, from anecdotal evidence that we heard was that there was about 2 feet of flooding in the downtown area. So that means there is the potential for flood from that type of flood. In 1965, there was another one, but people went out and built a dike along the railroad to stop that flood from getting to downtown, but they had to build it 5 feet high in order to keep that from happening. So it tells us that there is the potential for a large flood to at least come that direction. The other piece to this is looking at the watershed that contributes to that. So the amount of area that would contribute flow to Brush starts all the way down near Lyman. So it's a pretty big watershed. There's a lot of potential for flood to be generated there. So we felt, all right, so we're going to continue with this, looking at as though what that last study did is correct, and we're going to look at what the flood mitigation alternatives are using that information. So what I'm going to do now is talk through those. Keep in mind a couple things. So one, this analysis, it was meant to be conceptual, so it was very high level. We kept costs, making several assumptions and generalizing so that we could get at least a picture of what some of these would look like. For example, for insurance for houses, we looked at what the potential cost for insurance would be over a 50-year period. But we had to assume a single rate across all those homes because insurance takes into account the amount the home is worth, it takes into account contents coverage, etc. So there's a lot of things that we'd have to go to an insurance company and have them generate that, and it would be a pretty high level effort to do that. We also, like I said, we used that analysis that was already in place, so we didn't go reanalyze that floodplain. We kept with the original analysis. And then for the structures, so we're going to talk about some infrastructure to put in, dams, levees, etc. We just assumed a certain size, certain slope. We didn't go through the actual design process because that's a really lengthy, drawn-out process. So those are a couple things that we looked at, and then we also looked at a 50-year lifespan for these things. So all the costs we have look really high. They're going to be kind of staggering, but keep in mind they're also looking at a 50-year cost for all this stuff. And the reason we did that is to show that there's also maintenance costs and other things with these that if you just look at the cost to construct, it might seem a little bit low, but if you look at a 50-year period of maintenance and insurance and other things like that, it shows the true kind of comparison of these costs. We did not include inflation in that. That's another calculation that we just left out since they're all comparative. And then the other piece to this is each of these alternatives will require more coordination if the community wants to pursue them. Like DOT would need to be involved if a bridge needs to be changed. The railroad's going to be a big stakeholder here. And to be honest, the railroad's going to be a tough one because it's somebody that would have to be pretty involved. And we've seen historically in these types of studies that they don't really get involved with flood type studies and things like that. So with that, I'm going to jump into the different alternatives that we looked at. So the first one we looked at, all right, we have this massive watershed that's taking flow real close to Brush. So what's one thing we could do here? Well, one is to create a reservoir or a dam upstream to try to block that water off and release it at a steady rate so that it doesn't impact the town as heavily. What you see here is what we ended up looking at. And I'm going to focus on the actual exhibit first. If you look in the top left corner of that exhibit, you can see, it's kind of hard to tell, but we had to place the dam pretty far upstream of the town. The reason for that is it flattens out. And if you were to put a dam right next to the city, you would have this gigantic dam stretching, as far as the eye could see, trying to tie into high ground to catch that water. So we had to go pretty far upstream in order to get a dam to actually be manageable, if you will. The results of that are what's shown in this figure. So the blue line, we just looked at the 1% or the 100-year flow. The blue is showing what that flood risk is without a dam. The orange and the red hatching are showing if we put that dam in conceptually, that's how it would impact that floodplain. So you would get a little bit of a reduced risk, showing that, again, blue to orange, but through kind of the main town there, you see that red hatching, there still is the potential for flood. So even with putting in this dam, this massive structure, there still is the potential for flood through town. The reason for that is the floodplain kind of widens out right there before town, and then it spills in through the town. And because we had to set that dam so far back, we couldn't completely eliminate that risk by just adding a dam. So you see some costs here. Again, those are all going to look really high to people. The total there is, again, a 50-year cost, though. So it takes into account O&M for 50 years is about $4.9 million. 50 years of flood insurance. So that's another one. Again, we kind of assumed, all right, all those people who are still in the floodplain would need to pay flood insurance. So we assumed a rate, and so that would be about $7 million over a 50-year period. We added some flood proofing costs, which is pretty high there, to show that maybe those people could actually flood-proof their houses to make them a little bit safer and that type of thing. So if you just look at the cost of the dam, I mean, it's still high, but it's really the first three numbers there. The rest of it is like a land acquisition, operation and maintenance, etc. So I want to make sure you guys see that we took kind of a bunch of stuff into account to get that number. But comparatively, it's going to be one of the higher ones. That 105 million at the bottom, I mean, that's a staggering cost. That's a huge number. But it does take into account all those other pieces. And I'll show a side-by-side comparison of the different options at the end so you can see them, how they line up. All right, so the next one. This one we looked at a levee. And this one I would say is the most economical in terms of it's the lowest cost. Economical is probably a poor choice of words, but it does eliminate the flooding in town, or I shouldn't say eliminate because there still is, localized flooding and things like that. But it eliminates flooding from the creek in the town. And the reason for that is you can see it's kind of a yellow line that kind of cuts up along that orangish color. And what we did, we assumed that we'd have to build a levee starting out in the fields to block the flow and kind of force it into the main flow path.
When you're describing that, can you
Yeah.
kind of go to the map and show
Sure.
where you're?
Yeah, I was trying to
I
speak
know,
this,
I
but
know the sound isn't going to be as
There
good.
might be a pointer on there too.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Oh,
see- oh, yeah,
that's,
there's
that's
one.
okay.
I'll do
Let's
that.
let's do
Okay.
that.
Okay, so the levy we looked at, so we assumed that there's going to be land acquisition costs and things here that we assumed some of. But you can see this yellow line. We tried to be as deliberate as possible, trying to follow like property boundaries and things as best as we could. I mean, that would all have to come out in design of finding that actual alignment where it made sense to put that thing. You can also see here we came up just with a standard size, but it ends up being a pretty tall structure. I mean, you'd have basically a large earthen embankment coming all the way through here, which would be tough. But it is the only one of these options that contains this flow. So you see the orange area here is the new floodplain if that were in place. The blue is that original one that we talked about coming out here. So it does kind of reduce it in this core area. But again, right here is the key. Stopping that flow from coming this way and forcing it up along this corridor is what the levee does. To get that to work also, in order to stop from just pushing all the water to this other side, we would also have to do something similar on this side so that you don't end up inadvertently impacting more people.
Did you figure the
Yeah.
height of that berm? Or-
Yeah, it ranges, and it's conceptual, but I think it's between 5 and 15 feet depending on where you're at. So I mean, it can get pretty tall. So again, we did the same, looking at O&M over 50 years. We added some contingency just because these are conceptual numbers. This is a key piece. The railroad would have to be raised to be part of that levee. And again, the railroad historically has been tough to work with for other levee type projects and things. So that's a tough one. But there's some other structure crossings. Land acquisition could get high. Depending on where this final alignment moves, we just chose a single alignment and assumed a portion of that property would be bought out. And then the rest of the cost for a levee, though, is embankment fill, and then the core has to be a certain type of material. So altogether, for 50 years, conceptually about 42 million is the cost we looked at for that one. All right. The third, and I should have said at the beginning, there's actually 5 total that we'll look at here. So this is the third. The other 2 are kind of combined, so we'll look at those together. Nope, I didn't change the name of that slide. It is not the levee alternative. This one is actually, should say, a channel alternative. So we looked at, all right, what happens if we just make the channel larger? Let that flow push through a lot easier. In the engineering world right now, everyone is more about stream restoration and trying to get the stream to work in its natural form. So it'd be kind of going against that. But it was more of a, you've got a lot of floodwater coming through here in a 100-year flood. What if you did just channelize it and let flow through? This actually ended up being the most expensive one of all of them. It sounds easy to do, but the amount of cut and fill you'd have to do through this section in order to open it up, plus going through and raising all the bridges and the railroad through that, would end up getting really expensive. Again, we added some costs for flood-proofing houses, looking at insurance costs for those people who are still in the floodplain, etc. So some of that adds to it. But it also, again, doesn't quite remove the flooding from the flood risk from the core of the town here. Because, again, it doesn't block any of this flow from widening out and getting up through the town. So this one, again, is the most expensive, still doesn't completely reduce the risk. There are some things you could do maybe to improve this a little bit, maybe adding a little bit more detention upstream, but again, with that being the most expensive one, we didn't proceed with that one much further.
What's that number?
Down here, so that's about 110 million is the number. Again, 50 years, including insurance and flood and all that stuff, but yeah. Just the channel excavation we came up would be about 32 million. So that's with a unit cost of $25 per square foot of taking out that fill and placing it somewhere. So it's a lot of material to move is the big cost to actually build that one.
I know a bunch of farmers will do it a lot cheaper.
All right. So the last two I kind of combined into one slide. So the Corps of Engineers, like I said, they were working on something similar. So we took some of their numbers and came up, what they wanted to do is basically look at, all right, if you're going to flood-proof, just flood-proof, like none of those big projects we talked about, just look at all the homes and structures that are in the floodplain and just flood-proof them, how much would that cost to do? And so the numbers we're looking at, again, are pretty high, about 54 million. That's still a lot of money. And there would still be insurance requirements there because they are still in a floodplain, even though the structures are flood-proof. So that one came in around the 60 million range. Then we looked at, all right, what if everyone just buys flood insurance? Like, what is the benefit cost to doing these? Like, if everyone's paying flood insurance for 50 years, just everybody in the floodplain, again, based on a single unit cost number, we came up with that would be around 86 million total. Now, another thing here is, I should explain, so with flood insurance, the requirement for flood insurance is if you are in one of these areas and you have a federally backed mortgage, you are required to pay flood insurance. However, if you own your home, you're not required. It's a good idea because you're in a high-risk area, but so this just assumed everybody's paying it, not taking into account that some people own homes and other things like that. So again, there's a lot of assumptions that go into these numbers just for comparative purposes. So taking all those and comparing them, the slide might be a little hard to see, but it basically adds up these numbers. So you can see here the detention is the dam, about 104 million. The levee, 42 million. The channel modification is about 110 million. Floodproofing around 60 million, and flood insurance only about 80 million. Now we did one more thing with this. We lined up some of these other pieces so you could see how they relate. But we also ran something called HAZUS, and what that is a damage assessment. If this flood happens and it damages buildings, what is the cost of that? So with each of these alternatives, you can see if there were a flood after one of these got put in place, what would the resulting cost of that flood be? And so the highest number is going to be basically everyone's paying flood insurance and a flood comes in. And so our estimates came in that if a flood came in and damaged all these houses, it would be about 128 million in damages. So that's pretty high. But comparatively, you can see because we're reducing some of that flood through here, you can see these numbers lower. Again, the levy is the lowest because we're blocking off that flow from going through town. So floods aren't cheap either. That's the other piece to this. I did a couple other comparisons here. We did look at inflation just to show if inflation were to take into place, which one of these would be higher. And flood insurance is higher because it's the higher number, so and it's paid yearly, so it ends up increasing higher than the others. You can also see in this one, we took so that you could see what the infrastructure cost was compared to the other things. So for example, blue is the infrastructure cost. So the detention, levee, and channel alternatives all had an infrastructure cost, and you can compare those visually. And then purple's another big one, floodproofing. So if you look at just the floodproofing, you can see that these three have the highest floodproofing costs. So it's just another way of looking at comparing these visually of how each of those line up. So conclusion, I mean the main conclusion is, so with all these, we've delivered a report with these findings. It's got additional information and tables and some of the background on this. I just kind of gave you the high-level summary here. You know, this flood risk is something to take seriously. You know, but looking at these alternatives, they are pricey alternatives. There's, you know, there isn't. We were looking to see if we could find a kind of a cheaper solution, but all of these ended up being pretty high dollar, especially when you compare like looking at flood insurance and all the other things. So it's not an easy task to tackle, but we did want to at least present these findings, you know, so you see what your options are. I put up the contacts, my contact. I can give you my card. These are the contacts for the CWCB team that we worked with on this. So if you need to contact them, you can as well. I can give you my card or contact information as well. But that kind of summarizes what I had to present today. So if you have any questions, need to look at those in any more detail, I'm happy to.
Now, you said the levee system, that was the cheapest option, but it's difficult to get you'd have to raise the railroad in order to do that, right?
Correct, yeah.
And then under that option, how much of the floodway would be taken away under that option?
So let me go back to that real quick. So for the floodway, and I didn't put it on here, but the floodway kind of cuts down through here. So it cuts the floodway and the floodplain back to the levee limits, basically. So wherever you put those levee limits, that's where it pushes it back to. So the thing with levees is Code of Federal Regulations has a lot of criteria. Well, have 2 pages of criteria on it, which is a lot for that document. The reason why you have to raise the railroad is because you have to guarantee a certain amount of freeboard when the flood comes. And right now it doesn't have that. The other thing you can do is add a closing structure across it so that when the flood comes, it closes, or someone closes it so that flood water can't get through. And with both of those scenarios, we've seen them across the country, and both of those scenarios we've just had a lot of trouble getting railroads to even work with us on doing that.
Couldn't you dig a channel down?
That was one of the other alternatives where we were looking at digging the channel through the main streamline to push the flow that
I
way.
mean,
Yeah.
have the levee, but then when you come to the railroad, dig that deeper.
So we'd have to take it all the way downstream so that it has a place for that water to daylight. And we did start, so when we first started this, I should say, we looked at we were going to look at a combination alternative of like maybe if you do a dam and a levee and a channel. But each of these were so expensive, you actually ended up with a way higher cost anytime you tried to combine them. So it was actually better to look at one or the other in terms of saving costs that way.
When
Council?
you talk about flood proofing,
Mm-hmm.
can you explain to me what that means?
Yeah, so there's a couple things to do. So there's wet flood proofing and dry flood proofing. For industrial buildings, there's certain coatings and things you can put around buildings to keep water from seeping through, basically. For residences, it usually ends up being lifting houses and things like that to let flood water pass through. And so that's why a lot of times it's not that cheap, is because there's
And it ends up being the expense of the homeowners,
Well, it depends. I mean, if a city took on the task of raising everyone's house, I mean, I guess there could be something to that. So, but we didn't look into that. We just looked at what would the cost be. So we didn't look into like who would fund it, really. I mean, there are different grants available for hazard mitigation and flood mitigation through the state and FEMA. Some of them available for homeowners in some communities, but that's a process you have to go through to apply for that. So.
Question for you. Did the study take into account the different farming practices since 65 and 35? 65, 35, of course, we weren't here at 35, but farming back then, everything was plowed. That field looked black and it was real pretty until you got some rain and wouldn't hold any water. Now, almost everything is either fallow, no-tilled. There's stubble everywhere, and I would guess that watershed area would hold it 10 times what it used to when it was bare ground, fallow and stuff there. Did they use different numbers there, or did they use the same?
Yes.
Okay.
So looking back, we look back at the study. What the study does is it takes into account land use to determine how much water will seep in and how much will flow past. And they did use current land use in order to calculate that number. And actually, I believe, and I'll have to verify this, but I believe the old number, so there was an original study done back in the 70s. And I think the number from that flood that was calculated was actually higher than the one that's being used now. So it did actually lower between those two, but it's still a significant amount of water just because of that size of that watershed. I mean, it is attenuated in that model. Yeah.
So taking into account all of the work that was done from Lyman to Brush by private individuals to spread that water out after the 65 flood, that was all taken into account also?
I'm not sure about that. I'd have to look into that one and see. So what was taken into account was kind of the land cover and the land use, and how that would impact the soil types. There's also a factor for the amount of clay in the soil and that type of thing. But in terms of specific work that was done, there is topographic data that was used, so it should be reflected in that, in the different models.
And the catastrophic events in 35 and 65 were what?
Hang on a minute. We've already adopted the floodplain.
Yeah.
We're talking about mitigation, things that we can do because of that. So I don't want to rehash going back through everything that the study entailed. We went through for several months. I want to talk about what we're talking about, mitigation factors. And it looks to me like most of these mitigation factors are very, very expensive. But that needs to be what we're talking about. And this is for council. So does council have any other questions regarding that?
I've got one question.
Okay.
Earlier you had mentioned about if you're in the floodway, you can do a study, engineering for ensuring you don't, what you decide to build does not impact your neighbor.
Mm-hmm.
There's not confusion, but we had once contacted an engineer that had done some of these no-rise elevation studies.
Yeah.
And he had thrown out that if you have already good maps and cross-sectional data of where you're located at, to get a permit or no-rise certificate that you're not gonna affect others, it'd be like $1,500.
Okay.
But then we had a person come in and they said, well, they heard it's like 9,000 or?
Right, it was much more.
Yeah, like $9,000. Can you explain what happens when they do that no-rise? What do they look at? And if did this study and all the LiDAR information, does it give us that good cross-sectional data so that it doesn't cost the builder as much to develop their property if they choose to develop it?
Yeah. And, I guess I'll say, like anything else, you probably go to different people and get different quotes, and that's going to be part of that. The model that was used for that, we utilized it for this. It does have cross-sectional data at certain intervals along the stream that could be used for that. And you can look and see if the building is adequately represented. So if someone were to, let's just say a building got knocked down and rebuilt. It should be able to be pretty easy to show a no-rise with a smaller amount like you just said, because that footprint isn't changing. And the model is basically a model of the land surface running flow across it to see where that flow goes. So someone that has experience with these types of models should probably be able to do it fairly quickly. I can't really comment on the cost because again, it depends on who's giving that estimate.
Cross-sectional data is pretty well covers most
Yes.
of the brush, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, I saw the map that shows the cross-sections and those lines that run through the map.
Yeah.
Do they have to be right on that line to be able to use that cross-sectional data? Or if they're one block away, do they have to redo the whole hydrology
Yeah.
just to figure it out?
They don't have to do anything with the hydrology. They should actually keep the same hydrology. They're really just looking at what changes to that land affect where the water flows. Cross sections are typically meant to be representative of the space in front of them, behind them. So someone shouldn't have to go put like 10 more cross sections. Now, again, you could probably get an engineer who thinks that they need to. You talk to 4 different engineers sometimes, and they all have 4 different ways of doing things. But I would say with this model, you've got a good spacing. It does have representative of what's in the town, so someone who's got some RAS experience, HEC-RAS, which is the program that was used, should be able to do that fairly easily.
Any other questions? All right, thank you very much.
Yeah. Is that-
This is really for council. This is really not open to the public. We will have, when he's done with this presentation, we'll have a public comment period in 3 minutes. If you'd like to publicly comment, then
Can't publicly comment on something that's on the agenda, you didn't ask the right questions to begin with.
okay.
Okay.
All right, thank you.
Thanks a
All right.
lot.
All right. Thanks.
Okay. Okay, we move on to 4C. Do you need a minute, Andrea?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, moving on to 4C, citizens are invited to speak to council on items that are not on the agenda. There is a 3-minute time limit per person, unless otherwise noted by the mayor. Please note that no formal action will be taken on those items during this time due to the open meeting law provision. However, they may be placed on a future agenda if action is required. To better assist you, if you have questions, please submit them in writing to the city clerk and someone from staff will respond. Does anyone wish to speak? And if you'd like to speak about the floodplain, it's fine. You can talk about the floodplain. We're not taking action on this. This is just visitors and delegation and a presentation to council. If you'd like to comment publicly about what you just heard, that's fine. Or any other item. Would anyone like to speak? Okay, yes?
I said I had a question, as opposed to a comment.
If, like I said, if you have a question, Helen, submit it in writing to the city clerk, and someone with staff will get back to you with an answer.
Will they take the question to the engineers, or?
Absolutely, if we need to, we will, yes. Okay,
Can I just clarify?
sure.
We have the engineer that can help to a certain degree, but they're actually funded through CWCB. So mostly what we do with anything regarded to this current study, I have to send it to CWCB, and just to make sure that they're gonna be paying someone, that they have to get their approval first, because they're not paid by the city. If it's in regards to any technical issues regarding the National Flood Insurance Program or any of those type of things, there's no cost to the city. And those 2 names that were on there, you feel free to contact them directly, or you can go through the city. So there's different ways to get answers to certain things.
Yes,
Comment?
sure. Come on up, Scott. Please give your name and address.
All right, Scott Kimball, 17450 Beaver Creek Drive, Brush, Colorado. It was an interesting report he gave. A couple comments I wanted to mention was, in this day and age of wetlands, cattails and everything else, his point that people want to just leave things go back to nature caught my eye, because when we're talking drainage, and I'd mentioned this a meeting or two before, but the condition of the creek is a disaster. And for what you guys are wanting to do, keep the water out of the basements, keep the water table down, that's going the wrong way. And we're also on the same page for farming. Our water table has risen at least a couple feet, and I know there's lots of places in Brush that are pumping basements and such there too, but you guys have dredged out the city farm to the south there, and in my opinion, that's the right way to go. But you guys also got to what it costs the private party to try to do an engineering study or whatever else there. But just a clean creek, not even enlarging its boundaries, will probably handle 8 to 10 times what it is right now. And I'm in a catch-22. These rains are washing the banks down. My fields are alkalining out. You guys is same thing. You're getting water here, there. I would love to see some cooperation, and if you can afford the 42 to 109 million, maybe there's somewhere, at least a starting point right here. But I think your engineers could tell you every foot or so that we lowered that, maybe back to historically when it was cleaned out before, that would be directly, you would see the levels in town going down in, at least directly. I don't know what percentage would be. But, I don't like when they just want everything, they want all of our fields to slough off, the tumbleweeds to stay in there. It's going the wrong way.
All right, thank you, Scott.
You bet.
Anyone else like to comment?
During my staff report, I'll be talking about next steps. You may want
Okay.
to hang around a little bit for that.
Okay, moving on to 5A, management. We have presentation for recycling agreement with Morgan County. I should Dale having that.
I can cover that.
Okay.
This is a recycling agreement. We've been working with the county for a number of years now in our recycling program, and we've also enhanced what we do inside of the city limits as far as having available recycled containers, those type of things. We started off with about 50 in town. I think we've bought up to about 100 of these containers now, and I think the majority of those are out at this point in time. And we did it as a pilot program with the guidance of the city council, and everyone's been pretty excited about it. It's worked out great, especially when the holiday season comes around, all the boxes, and as more and more people, as time goes by, buy online, there's more boxes, materials. So we are getting more and more recyclables all the time that we're collecting curbside. We also, across near the post office, we have some recycled containers. Some are strictly for cardboard, and then also we have regular household recyclable drop off there as well. We've done a pretty good job with educating the public on what you can put in, what you can't put into the recycling. It keeps going really well, and I think countywide, the last numbers that I believe I heard, if I heard correctly, about half the cardboard in the county total comes from brush. So
This last quarter was a little bit more than half.
yeah, a little more than half. So we're doing excellent on that. So that's worked out really well. Also, the landfill and the state, they track how many recyclables go through, and then we get a little recycling rebate back from the state. And so every quarter, I believe it is it every quarter?
We get, and part of this agreement talks about that. For each quarter, we get 50% of whatever was brought in from our tonnage. We split that with the county because they're the one doing the billing and everything, and we're the one bringing it to the county. So like for the fourth quarter of 18, we just received a check for roughly $550.
So this program really works out well for us right now, and we want to continue moving forward with it. And the agreement is with us in the county, just keeping it formalized, and so we're recommending that we approve it, and we'll get it off to the county, get them to execute it, and we'll continue with this program.
Yeah, and in talking to Dale, it's working because it's bringing us back funding that we didn't have, plus it's lowering the weight that we're taking that was just thrown away. So I think it's a good program. All right. That it?
Yep.
Okay, do we have a motion to approve or deny the recycling agreement?
I move for approval.
Do we have a motion to approve by Dan Scalisi? Do we have a second?
Second.
Second by Dana Sherman. Discussion? Andrea, roll call vote, please.
Mayor Bain,
Yes.
Counselor Lundstrom,
Yes.
Counselor Quinlan,
Yes.
Counselor Scalisi,
Yes.
Counselor Sherman.
Yes.
Okay, moving on to 6, finance.
Make a motion to approve city expenditures from January 28th of 2019 to February 11th of 2019 totaling $256,551.14.
Have a motion to approve. Do we have a second?
A second.
Okay, second. Discussion? Roll call vote, please.
Mayor Bain,
Yes.
Counselor Lundstrom,
Yes.
Counselor Quinlan,
Yes.
Counselor Scalisi,
Yes.
Counselor Sherman.
Yes.
Okay, moving on to number 7, staff reports. Joanne?
I have nothing this evening.
Okay, Police Chief Derek.
Thank you. Just briefly, I spoke with you at the last meeting about the JAG grant. The state extended the deadline for that 2 more weeks out, so we're taking that extra 2 weeks to bolster our justifications in the grant. So just a quick update on that. It should be on your agenda in 2 weeks for approval, hopefully. So that's all I have. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Chief. City Clerk Andrea.
Okay. I just wanted to update you a little bit on the 2020 census. The county has agreed to update our boundary maps, which means they will update to the Census Bureau all of the city limit boundaries for our state and all of the residents and addresses that are included in that. And also, the city of Fort Morgan's best and brightest intern has kind of taken it on as her project to reach out to the census to get someone out here to talk about just the notification and advertising of it as it gets closer. So Matt has reached out to her as well, and we will work with them once they get out here and kind of get mobilized on the informing the public. So I'll keep you posted.
Can I add an addition, if you don't mind?
Sure.
Oh,
Stand up.
yeah,
so
sure.
We can hear you.
While I was at the CCCMA conference, the census did a presentation, provided a bunch of contact information and a bunch of advertising information for that. So I've already contacted Daniela about that today, just to
Oh,
let
good.
you know.
All right, thank you, Matt.
Yep.
Okay, City Administrator Monty.
Okay, gonna keep it a little short because I want to have a little more discussion on the floodway. But essentially, on the Brush Agri Park project, everything's still moving forward with that as planned. We do have a couple things from the title company that city attorney and I are ironing out as we speak. And so we'll get those resolved this week, hopefully, so that the lamb harvesting guys can move forward with purchasing the property. They are still out there doing some site work out there, as well as the footers that were pre-approved. And also, I've given Dale Clark, our Public Works Director, the thumbs up that he can start working with them on laying the water lines out there. They have all the material there. They'd like to start that process pretty soon. If you have any questions, or if ever you want to have a quick drive out there to go look around, just let me know, and you guys can go out there and be on the ground and look at what's happening. Also, just a quick note, the Water Advisory Committee, they did have a meeting not too long ago, and I did explain to them about a potential water project for the city that's coming up. Right now, it's just in the discussion phases with our water engineers and with staff, but I imagine probably the next 60, 90 days it'll come to the city council if those discussions prove to be going in a positive direction and this project's doable for us. The floodway, so the numbers are really staggering, so really high numbers. And we did expect those to be pretty high. Some of council members may have been here 10, 12 years ago when we studied this situation before. And one of the criticisms that we had back then, when we had a different engineering firm look at alternatives for the channel here, first, everyone said the same thing, is that the levee is the best option, financially. But back then, they had like a $2 million number, and when they came out with that number, $2 million, we said, we don't know how you did this study, but there's no way you're gonna acquire land, move that much dirt for $2 million. Even though it was 10 years ago, it's still not even remotely can you do a project of that size. So the numbers that and so at that time we said, well, we don't even know what to do with this alternative study now because the numbers you gave us, they're so low. And the example back then was that, well, how are you gonna address the irrigation ditches that go through there? You know, a farmer having land on one side, then you're gonna build a berm. So there's other impacts that you have to think about as well. So, so we've studied this. I think this is about the third or fourth study at this point in time. One of the things that is still on my list to do is visit with CDOT. I don't think the solution is a near-term solution because no one has the funding for this project at this point in time. Even if you go to the state and utilize the pre-disaster mitigation grant funds and hazard mitigation grant funds through the state, which are funded federally, there's still not enough grant funding, to do this. You probably be pulling the entire states to do this, and so you still have to go through what's called a cost benefit. I think it's called it's either a cost benefit or benefit cost analysis. I can't remember. Benefit cost, I think, is what it is. It's a BC. But going through a benefit cost analysis, it's probably going to show to the state and the federal government that it's not the best use of money. You're going to spend more than what it's worth, so you have to look at that piece of it. The other thing is, I think it's really worth our time to probably get an engineer out here to really explain to us about how much it really does cost, because we have that question, and we had someone come in not too long ago and say they wanted to do a small addition to their house, but then it was gonna, I can't remember if it was $9,000 or $15,000, but they said it raised the cost so much that they decided not to do it. But 9 months ago, I had talked to an engineer that had done work in the area, said it should not even cost that, any close to that. So at least that way we can give the public a better idea, at least council knows what that real cost is, because it's better to have accurate information than misinformation. Other calls I still have is still a call in a meeting with Colorado Department of Transportation, and they're planning for I-76, one of the bridge structure, or the bridge structure that Beaver Creek goes through. That one is supposed to be widened and in the near future, as my understanding is, there's potentially some funding coming up. But visit with their hydrology folks that specialize in floodplains and see if there's anything they can do now. If they're gonna widen it by, for example, 50 feet, is there a way they can widen it by 200 feet with a clear span bridge? So if we ever get to dredging the creek and partnerships with some of the farmers, those type of things, then maybe that could help. But remember, whatever we do, we have to restudy everything to go back to FEMA to get them to change floodplain, floodway. You have to do another study on it. So there's a lot of steps, and 14 years ago when council went through this process to determine how to prioritize floodplain, because there's all these roadblocks, we put it down on the bottom of the list. I think it was out of 16, it was 16 because just had no funding to do this. Other thing, the railroad, it's a challenge, in regards to working with the railroad, but won't hurt to give a phone call to them, see if they have any near-term, long-term plans of widening that structure that they have. And then also near where Chuck Miller's at, there's another berm there that creates a problem, one of the barriers to the channel. Maybe they can put that on their list at some point in time. Doesn't sound like it's probably too likely, but at least we can call and find out if there's a possibility there. Other thing is, good news now compared to in years past, and why we didn't tackle it 14 years ago. The survey data that the Corps of Engineers had for this stretch of Beaver Creek, half the data was lost. And so when they talk about the HEC modeling, it was HEC modeling that was in years past. There's different programs out there now, much better technology. And when we found out that half of the data for the survey work that they had done back in the seventies was missing, they could come with half of it, that's when we asked FEMA, or excuse me, Corps of Engineers, what would it cost? And they said probably roughly $500,000 back then to go back and do all these measurements of the drainage area and resurvey it all. And fortunately now today, the state did receive a grant, and the money that was used to do all this more recent survey work, it's called LiDAR survey, that wasn't available a year ago. So now they have, I can't remember how far down the stretch of Beaver Creek this new survey data is now, but at least that's on record. And I know they went north of Brush, south of Brush, and I can't remember how far south, Rigel, but it's far enough now that whatever we do, survey data is at least taken care of. So there's a few other steps involved. The state still wants to work with us, but we have to see if there's any other possibilities of figuring out how to get that cost lower. And I don't think we're ever gonna be able to pay to get the floodway totally out of Brush, but what if we can take it from half through town to 20%, of our city? That could make a huge difference as well. But anyways, that's what I'm targeting right now, and also if there's any other questions from anyone in the community, if they just write that down and send it to the city clerk, we can at least start getting those answers. That's all I have.
Okay. Moving on to 8, mayor and council reports. Does anyone have anything they'd like to report on? Nope. Okay, I look for a motion to adjourn.